The early morning sun cast long shadows across the tailor's kitchen table, where a manila envelope lay unopened like an unwelcome guest. Margaret Taylor's hands trembled as she reached for it, her morning coffee growing cold beside her. They'd been expecting this letter, dreading it really, ever since Robert's factory had shut down 6 months ago. "Just open it," Maggie Robert said softly, his once commanding voice now weathered by worry. "Whatever it says, we'll face it together." Margaret's fingernails, no longer perfectly manicured as they'd been in better days, broke the seal. As she unfolded the crisp letterhead, her breath caught in her throat. There, emblazoned in elegant silver typography, were the words Chen Enterprises Global. Chen, she whispered, the name striking a chord deep in her memory. Her eyes darted to the bottom of the page, seeking confirmation of what her heart already knew. The signature, bold and confident, belonged to Sarah Chen, CEO. The eviction notice itself was almost an afterthought. 30 days to vacate. Standard legal language. References to missed payments and failed payment plans. But Margaret could barely focus on the words as 2 decades of memories crashed over her like a wave. "Robert," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Robert, it's her." He took the letter, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, a recent concession to age he'd been too proud to make in their more prosperous days. His face, already pale from months of sleepless nights worrying about bills, went ashen. "It can't be," he muttered, but they both knew it was. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, more confined, like the walls themselves were closing in with the weight of their past decisions. Through the window, Margaret could see their overgrown lawn they'd had to let the gardener go months ago. The luxury sedan they'd leased in better times sat in the driveway, a repossession notice tucked under its wiper blade. Their fall from grace had been swift and merciless. The factory closure had only been the final blow in a series of financial missteps. Credit card debt, a second mortgage they couldn't afford, medical bills from Robert's back surgery, it had all piled up like the unopened bills in Margaret's desk drawer. But none of that seemed to matter now. All Margaret could think about was a quiet, determined girl who had once lived in their spare bedroom. A girl they had treated as less than family. A girl who had disappeared 20 years ago, leaving nothing but a folded note and a silence that, in retrospect, had been deafening. "She owns the mortgage company," Robert said flatly, stating the obvious. The girl he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The unwanted foster child they had once viewed as a burden now held their fate in her hands. And based on how they had treated her, they already knew what that fate would be. 20 years earlier, on a rain-slicked October evening, 11-year-old Sarah Chen stood on the tailor's front porch, her entire life contained in a worn backpack and a manila folder of documents. Social workers had told her this would be different. The Taylors had a good reputation in the foster care system. But Sarah had learned not to trust such promises. 3 homes in 2 years had taught her that reputations rarely told the whole story. The door opened to reveal Margaret Taylor, perfectly coiffed even at 7 in the evening, wearing an apron that seemed more for show than actual use. Her smile was practiced, the kind that appeared in church directories and PTA meetings. "You must be Sarah," Margaret said, her eyes quickly taking in Sarah's rain-dampened hair and second-hand clothes. Something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. "Well, come in before you catch your death." The social worker, MS. Patterson, helped Sarah inside with her things, running through the usual paperwork with Margaret while Sarah stood dripping on the immaculate hardwood floors. Through an archway she could see a dining room where 2 teenagers, the Taylors' biological children, were doing homework. They barely glanced up. "This is temporary," Margaret announced once MS. Patterson had left, leading Sarah to a small room past the laundry area. Just until they find a more permanent placement, the room smelled of mothballs and disuse, with a narrow bed and a dresser that had seen better days. "We'll get you enrolled in school tomorrow. For now, try not to make too much noise. Robert, Mr. Taylor works early." That first night set the pattern for what would become years of careful navigation through the Taylors' home. Sarah quickly learned the unwritten rules: stay quiet, stay out of sight, and above all, don't ask for anything. While the Taylors' children, Jason and Emma, enjoyed new clothes and the latest gadgets, Sarah wore church donations and kept her school supplies functioning long past their natural lifespan. "We're not running a charity here" became Robert Taylor's favorite refrain, though the monthly foster care checks were cashed promptly. "You should be grateful for what you get." The words were usually accompanied by a stern look that suggested asking for anything, even necessities, was a personal affront to their generosity. Meals were particularly treacherous territory. Sarah was fed. Yes, the Taylors were too conscious of appearances to do otherwise, but there was always an undercurrent of resentment. She learned to eat quickly and quietly, to never ask for seconds, to volunteer to do the dishes just to escape the tension. But in this atmosphere of barely concealed hostility, Sarah discovered her greatest weapon: excellence. While the Taylors viewed her as a burden, her teachers began to see something else. Mrs. Rodriguez in English class praised her essays. Mr. Chen, no relation in mathematics, spoke of her natural aptitude. By 13, she was secretly taking advanced placement classes, arranging her schedule so the Taylors wouldn't notice the extra workload. Late at night, Sarah would study by flashlight under her covers, careful not to make a sound. She'd learned that asking to keep the lights on after 9 brought lectures about electricity costs and taking advantage. The beam of light became her sanctuary, illuminating textbooks borrowed from the school library, highlighting passages that spoke of worlds beyond the suffocating confines of the Taylor household. Her report cards were a source of quiet pride and loud resentment. Straight A's earned cold stares at the dinner table, and muttered comments about showing off Margaret would purse her lips, comparing Sarah's grades to Jason's and Emma's more modest achievements. "I think you're better than our kids," became another familiar refrain. But Sarah had discovered something powerful in those lonely nights of secret study. Knowledge couldn't be taken away. While the Taylors could control her physical environment, deny her new clothes, or withhold their affection, they couldn't dim her mind. Each perfect test score, each teacher's commendation, each academic achievement became a brick in the foundation of her future escape. She began keeping a journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. In it, she wrote her dreams: college acceptance letters, business suits, corner offices. While the Taylors saw a burden to be endured, Sarah was secretly architecting her liberation through academic excellence and unwavering determination. By 16, she had already mapped out her path to freedom. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Bennett, became a silent conspirator, helping her navigate college applications and scholarship opportunities. Sarah took on a part-time job at the local grocery store, telling the Taylors it was for a school project while secretly saving every penny for application fees. The Taylors' presence in her life had taught her valuable lessons, though not the ones they'd intended. Their emotional neglect had shown her the importance of self-reliance. Their constant criticism had cultivated her resilience. Their attempts to diminish her had only fueled her determination to rise above their expectations. As she sat in her small room each night, studying by that concealed flashlight, Sarah wasn't just learning algebra and literature, she was learning that success would be her sweetest revenge. Not revenge in the form of cruelty or retribution, but in the quiet triumph of becoming everything they said she couldn't be. Dawn was just breaking when Sarah Chen shouldered her backpack on her 18th birthday. She'd waited for this moment for 7 years, planned it down to the minute. The Taylors were still asleep as she crept down the stairs, each step calculated to avoid the creaks she'd memorized over the years. On the kitchen table, she left a single folded note: "Thank you for teaching me exactly who I never want to become." Her savings from the grocery store job, carefully hidden in a hollowed-out textbook, would cover her bus ticket to Stanford and 2 weeks in a youth hostel. The full scholarship would take care of the rest. As she closed the front door for the last time, Sarah allowed herself one small smile. The Taylors wouldn't notice she was gone until dinner time, when their free household help didn't appear to wash the dishes. The Stanford campus felt like stepping into another world. Her entire dorm room was bigger than the space she'd lived in at the Taylors', and her roommate Rebecca's casual kindness nearly brought her to tears. But old habits died hard. Sarah still hoarded snacks in her desk drawer and studied late into the night, though she no longer needed the flashlight. "You don't have to work 3 jobs," Rebecca would say, watching Sarah rush from her library assistant position to her cafeteria shift, then to her late-night data entry work. "Your scholarship covers everything." But Sarah wasn't working just to survive anymore. Every dollar she earned went into a carefully managed savings account. She'd learned about compound interest in her first business class and recognized it as a path to freedom. While other students spent their weekends at parties, Sarah spent hers studying investment strategies and real estate market trends. Her first real breakthrough came during her junior year. Dr. James, her real estate finance professor, noticed her exceptional work and recommended her for an internship at Wellington Properties, a boutique firm specializing in distressed assets. "You have an eye for potential," her supervisor, Michael Torres, told her after she identified a promising property others had overlooked. "You see value where most people see ruins." Sarah knew why she'd spent years looking past surface appearances, finding opportunity in overlooked spaces. The internship turned into a job offer before she'd even graduated, and Sarah threw herself into learning every aspect of the business. She volunteered for the most challenging projects, worked weekends, and built a reputation for turning around properties others had written off. 4 years into her career, Sarah spotted an opportunity that would change everything. A neglected apartment complex in a transitioning neighborhood was going into foreclosure. The numbers didn't look good on paper, but Sarah recognized something familiar in the residents' faces, the same determination she'd seen in her own reflection all those years ago. "Let me manage this acquisition," she pitched to the investment committee. "We can make this work." When they declined, citing too much risk, Sarah made her boldest move yet. She scraped together every penny she'd saved, took out loans, and bought the property herself. 16-hour days became her norm. She learned plumbing from YouTube videos, negotiated with contractors, and worked directly with residents to create payment plans they could afford. Slowly, the property turned around. Not through luxury upgrades or by pushing out existing tenants, but by building a community that took pride in their home. The success caught attention. Other struggling property owners began approaching her, and Sarah Chen Properties was born. She hired staff who shared her vision, including many who'd grown up in circumstances similar to hers. Her company motto became building better futures, not just for profits, but for people. As her reputation grew, so did her opportunities. She specialized in taking over distressed properties and transforming them into thriving communities. Each success funded the next acquisition, and within 5 years, Sarah Chen Properties had become Chen Enterprises Global, with a portfolio spanning 3 states. The corner office in her downtown headquarters was bigger than the Taylor's entire first floor, but Sarah kept one reminder of her past, the flashlight she'd used to study by, now displayed in a clear case on her desk. It served as a reminder not of the hardship, but of her determination to rise above it. Her company's success wasn't just measured in dollars. Sarah established a foundation providing scholarships to foster children. She implemented innovative housing programs that helped low-income families build equity while renting. Every decision was filtered through the lens of her experience, what would have made a difference in her life. The irony wasn't lost on her when her company began acquiring mortgage portfolios from failing banks during the financial crisis. Each acquisition was scrutinized not just for profit potential, but for opportunities to help struggling families stay in their homes. Her board sometimes questioned her methods, especially when she approved loan modifications that cut into profits. Real estate isn't just about properties, she would tell them. It's about people. And sometimes people need a second chance. By her 35th birthday, Chen Enterprises Global had become one of the largest property management firms on the West Coast. Sarah had been featured in business magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and asked to advise on housing policy. But she never forgot what drove her: the desire to create the safe, stable home she'd never had as a child. When her assistant placed the mortgage modification application from Robert and Margaret Taylor on her desk, Sarah felt the universe had come full circle. Their financial struggles were laid bare in the paperwork: the factory closure, the depleted savings, the looming foreclosure. She sat in her office until long after sunset, staring at their familiar names. In that moment, Sarah realized she faced the same choice she'd confronted countless times in her journey to use her power to hurt or to help. The Taylors had taught her who she didn't want to become. Now she had the opportunity to show them who she'd chosen to be instead. Tomorrow, she would visit them, not as the unwanted foster child they'd once dismissed, but as the CEO who held their fate in her hands. And in that role, she would make a decision that would prove success is about more than just surviving. It's about thriving enough to break the cycles that once threatened to break you. The Taylors' descent into financial ruin had been as gradual as a tide coming in, then as sudden as a wave crashing over their heads. First came the whispers of the factory budget cuts, outsourcing, restructuring. Robert had dismissed them, secure in his 30 years of service as floor manager. Then came the meeting where terms like global competition and downsizing echoed through the conference room, leaving 200 workers, including Robert, clutching severance packages that wouldn't last through winter. "It's temporary," Margaret had said, unconsciously echoing the words she'd once used about Sarah. "You'll find something else," but at 62, Robert discovered that experience meant less than the salary it commanded. Younger, cheaper workers filled the positions he applied for. Each rejection letter chipped away at his pride until he stopped opening them altogether. Their savings evaporated like morning dew. First went the luxuries, the country club membership, the weekly dinners out, the gardener. Then the necessities began to slip: the health insurance, the car payments, the mortgage. Margaret took a job at the local supermarket, the same one where Sarah had once worked, but her earnings barely covered their mounting medical bills. "We could ask Jason and Emma for help," Margaret suggested one night, staring at a stack of past due notices. "They have their own families to support," Robert replied, though they both knew their children's silence spoke volumes about years of strained relationships. The same self-absorption they'd modeled with Sarah had come full circle, leaving them alone in their hour of need. Their search for affordable housing became increasingly desperate. Each rental application was denied due to their poor credit. Senior housing had years-long waiting lists. Friends who'd once welcomed them to dinner parties now made excuses when they called. In their desperation, they'd applied everywhere, including to Chen Enterprises Global, known for its more lenient modification programs. They didn't make the connection to their former foster child. Sarah Chen was a common enough name, and their minds had long ago filed her away with other uncomfortable memories. Meanwhile, in her corner office 40 stories above the city, Sarah sat alone with their applications spread across her desk. The setting sun cast long shadows across the paperwork, but she'd been staring at it so long she could recite their details from memory. Their financial fall was documented in cold numbers: income reduced by 82%, savings depleted, credit score plummeting, multiple loan defaults. She picked up her old flashlight from its display case, turning it over in her hands. How many nights had she studied by its beam, dreaming of a future where she would never feel powerless again? Now she held real power: the power to give or take away, to help or harm, to show mercy or exact revenge. A mess. Chen, her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The board is waiting for your decision on the Taylor application. Should I tell them you're declining it?" Sarah closed her eyes, memories washing over her like waves. The cold dinners when she'd worked late at the grocery store. The winter coat she'd mended 3 years running because asking for a new one meant enduring Robert's lectures about gratitude. The college acceptance letter she'd celebrated alone in her room, knowing they wouldn't care. "Not yet," she replied. "I need to handle this one personally." She pulled up their current address on her computer. Their house, once a symbol of middle-class success, now showed signs of neglect in the street view photos. Peeling paint, overgrown lawn, a general air of defeat. Just like the apartment complex that had launched her empire, it was a property in distress occupied by people in crisis. Sarah opened a drawer and pulled out a small notebook, its pages yellow with age. Her childhood journal, rescued from under the floorboards years after she'd left. She'd written in it the night before her 18th birthday one day, "I'll be strong enough to help people who are hurting, even if they once hurt me. That's real power." Her younger self's words hit her with unexpected force. She'd spent years building a company that gave people second chances, that saw value where others saw liability. Would she make an exception now, just because the applicants had once made her feel as worthless as their current circumstances rendered them? "What makes us better than our past," she whispered to herself, "is not how we treat those who were kind to us, but how we treat those who weren't." Still, doubt crept in. The Taylors had shown her no compassion when they held the power. Their kindness had been measured in calculated portions, always with an eye to appearances rather than actual care. Would showing them mercy now simply enable their behavior? Would it undermine the hard lessons life was finally teaching them? Sarah pulled up their payment history, noting how they'd struggled to keep up with payments even before Robert lost his job. They'd refinanced twice, each time stretching their budget thinner. But between the numbers, she saw something familiar: the desperate attempts to maintain dignity in the face of declining circumstances. She thought about her company's mission: building better futures. Did that only apply to strangers? Was redemption a gift she could offer to everyone except those who had hurt her most? The sun had set completely now, leaving her office in darkness except for the city lights twinkling below. Sarah switched on her old flashlight, its beam still strong after all these years. In its light, she began to write 2 documents: a mortgage modification agreement that would allow the Taylors to stay in their home with payments they could afford, and a letter she'd waited 20 years to write. MS. Chen, her assistant's voice came again. Should I have security escort the Taylors out when they come for their appointment tomorrow? Sarah looked at the flashlight, then at her reflection in the darkened window, no longer a powerless foster child, but a woman who had built an empire on the foundation of second chances. No, she replied, her voice firm. I'll meet with them personally. She gathered the papers, her decision made. Tomorrow she would face the Taylors not as the unwanted child they'd once dismissed, but as the woman who could choose between vengeance and grace. In showing them mercy, she would prove that their greatest failure hadn't been in losing their money or their status, but in failing to see the power of kindness when they'd had the chance to show it. The choice between revenge and compassion wasn't really a choice at all. It was a test not of the Taylors' worthiness for help, but of Sarah's commitment to being someone different than those who had hurt her. In helping them, she wouldn't just be saving their home, she would be honoring the promise she'd made to herself in that hidden journal so many years ago. Sarah placed the flashlight back in its case and gathered her things. Tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, not through punishment, but through the kind of grace that forces people to confront who they are and who they could become. In the end, that would be a far more powerful statement than any revenge could make. Sarah stood outside the Taylors' front door, her heart hammering against her tailored suit jacket. The house looked smaller than she remembered, worn down by years and neglect. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the doorbell, a sound that still triggered memories of coming home late from her grocery store job, dreading the lectures that would follow. Margaret Taylor opened the door, her perfectly coiffed hair now streaked with grey, her confident posture replaced by a subtle stoop. The moment of recognition was electric. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. "Hello, Mrs. Taylor," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "May I come in?" Margaret stepped back automatically, her movements jerky like a poorly operated puppet. "Robert," she called out, her voice trembling. "Robert, you need to come here." The kitchen was smaller than Sarah remembered, the formica table more scratched, the curtains more faded. Robert sat there, looking older and smaller than the man who had once loomed so large in her nightmares. Their eviction notice lay between them like a landmine. You're the CEO," Margaret whispered, still standing. "I am," Sarah replied, taking a seat without waiting to be invited. "But I'm also the little girl you once told would never amount to anything. The burden you reminded me I was, every single day for 7 years." Robert's face had gone ashen. "Sarah, we..." "Please," she held up a hand. "I'm not finished." She placed her briefcase on the table, the expensive leather a stark contrast to the worn formica. "Do you remember this kitchen table? I used to do my homework here after washing your dishes. You would sit right there, Mr. Taylor, counting out the foster care checks while telling me how expensive I was to keep." The silence that followed was heavy with 2 decades of unspoken words. "We were wrong," Robert finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "The way we treated you." "Wrong doesn't begin to cover it," Sarah interrupted, her calm exterior belying the storm of emotions beneath. "You had a child in your care who had lost everything, who needed nothing more than basic kindness, and you treated her like an unwanted obligation." Margaret began to cry silently, tears tracking down her lined face. "I'm not here for apologies, though I won't reject them if they're genuine," Sarah continued. "I'm here because you applied for a mortgage modification through my company. Do you understand the irony of that? The unwanted foster child now holds the power to make you homeless." The Taylors seemed to shrink further into themselves. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out 2 documents. "I spent a long time considering what to do when your application crossed my desk. Part of me wanted you to understand exactly how it feels to have no safe place to call home. to experience the vulnerability you once subjected me to." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then her voice softened slightly. "But that would make me exactly what you tried to make me, someone who hurts others because they themselves are hurting. And I decided a long time ago that your greatest gift to me was showing me exactly who I didn't want to become." She slid the first document across the table. "This is a new mortgage agreement. The payments are adjusted to what you can actually afford. My company will hold the note." Robert's hands shook as he reached for the papers. "Why? Why would you help us?" Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt. "Because 20 years ago you taught me that power without compassion is just another form of cruelty. Every success I've achieved, every property I've developed, every family I've helped keep in their home, it's all been in defiance of the lessons you tried to teach me about scarcity and unworthiness." She walked to the door, then turned back one last time. "The choice is yours now. Sign the papers, keep your home, and maybe learn something about kindness. Or don't, and face eviction. Either way, I've made my peace with the past. The question is, can you make peace with who you were and who you still have the chance to become?" The morning sun caught the pearl necklace at her throat, her first major purchase when her company went public. "The cycle of cruelty stops here," she said softly. "Not because you deserve mercy, but because I deserve peace. And sometimes those two things look exactly the same." The signed mortgage papers appeared on Sarah's desk the next morning. Paper clipped to them was a handwritten letter, Margaret's once precise handwriting now shaky with age and emotion. "Dear Sarah, we spent last night reading old documents from your time with us, report cards we'd ignored, awards we'd dismissed, the quiet hopes we'd crushed through our indifference. Each achievement stands as a testament not to our guidance, but to your determination to rise above our cruelty. Your grace in helping us keep our home has shown us the depth of our failure, not just as foster parents, but as human beings. We don't ask for forgiveness, we haven't earned that right. But please know that your success has become our greatest lesson in humility and redemption. With deepest remorse. Margaret and Robert Taylor." Sarah placed the letter in her desk drawer, next to her old flashlight and childhood journal. She didn't need their remorse to validate her success, but their acknowledgement closed a chapter that had remained unfinished for 2 decades. Over the next few months, the Taylors made their payments on time. They sent holiday cards that Sarah's assistant filed away unopened. When they tried to invite her to dinner, she responded with a polite but firm note explaining that while she wished them well, she needed to maintain professional boundaries. At a foster care fundraiser later that year, Sarah shared her story publicly for the first time. "Trauma doesn't have to define us," she told the audience. "Each act of unkindness we experience is an opportunity to choose a different path. Success isn't just about proving others wrong, it's about proving to yourself that you can break the cycle of hurt." The Chen Enterprises global portfolio continued to grow, but with a unique focus on compassionate property management. Sarah implemented programs helping struggling families maintain their homes through difficult times. Each decision was guided by the principle that power without empathy serves no one. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports, Sarah received an unexpected email. The Taylors had started a support group for foster parents, sharing their story as a cautionary tale and working to ensure other foster children received the love and support she hadn't. Sarah smiled slightly as she read the email. She wouldn't attend their meetings or endorse their initiative, some boundaries needed to remain firm. But knowing that her choice to show grace had sparked positive change brought its own kind of peace. In choosing compassion over vengeance, Sarah hadn't just helped the Taylors keep their home, she'd helped them find their humanity. And in the process, she'd proven that the greatest victory over past trauma isn't in getting even, but in getting better. Her old flashlight still sat on her desk, no longer a reminder of dark nights spent studying in secret, but a symbol of how far she'd come and the light she'd chosen to bring into the world. In the end, both parties emerged from their shared journey as stronger, more self-aware individuals. Their growth was evident not only in how they faced challenges, but also in the way they approached the future with empathy, courage, and determination. One side discovered untapped reserves of patience and a renewed sense of purpose, while the other embraced vulnerability and transformed it into strength. Together, they demonstrated that growth often comes not from avoiding difficulties, but from meeting them head-on. This journey highlights the profound power of resilience. It is not a trait we are born with, but one we cultivate through persistence, reflection, and hope. Resilience turns setbacks into stepping stones and reveals the latent potential that lies within every struggle. It serves as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, growth and healing remain possible. Let this be a call to action for each of us to nurture resilience in our own lives. Whether through small daily acts of courage or grand gestures of perseverance, we can all rise above life's trials. Let us stand as beacons of hope, showing that growth is within reach and that the human spirit is capable of remarkable transformation.